612 BC. The city of Nineveh was founded on the eastern bank of the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq. With an estimated population of between 100,000 and 150,000 people, it was the largest city in the world at that time. The city's walls were so thick that Assyrian kings organized chariot races on top of them. Inside the palace are rooms adorned with carved stone panels depicting military campaigns, lion hunts, and the suffering of conquered peoples in extraordinary detail. The royal library contains tens of thousands of clay tablets copied and preserved by royal decree, which contain the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world. This was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, the first military superpower in human history. It stretched from Egypt to Persia, and from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. It was an empire built on iron weapons and professional soldiers, as well as a calculated and effective application of terror, to the extent that cities would surrender without a fight rather than face the consequences of an assault. For 300 years, no one could stop them. The Egyptians tried, the Babylonians tried, the Elamites tried. All failed. Nineveh stood firm, growing ever larger and more powerful with each generation as it added the riches of the known world to its palaces, libraries, and armories. Then, in 612 BC, the Babylonians and Medes formed an alliance and marched on Nineveh. The siege lasted 3 months. 3 months against a city that had ruled the world for 3 centuries. Its fall was complete devastation. The Babylonians did not merely conquer Nineveh, they obliterated it. They burned everything that could burn. They demolished everything that could be demolished. They even diverted the river, leaving the remains submerged. Within a generation, the world's greatest city had been reduced to a heap of earth and ash. 200 years later, the Greek historian Xenophon passed through with his army. He wrote about a large mound. He asked the local people what it was. No one knew. The city had been destroyed so completely, wiped out so utterly, that 2 centuries after its fall, no one could recall its name. The world's first superpower. It vanished in 3 months. It was forgotten within 200 years. This is the story of Nineveh. Before Nineveh, there was Ashur. This small town was situated on a rocky promontory upstream of the Tigris River, around 100 kilometers south of where Nineveh would later be founded. Founded around 2500 BC by a people who called themselves the Assyrians, it was named after the god Ashur. For the first 1,000 years after its foundation, Assur was not a particularly notable city. It was a trading center. Merchants sent donkey caravans carrying tin and textiles northwards to Anatolia and returned with silver and gold. The merchants kept meticulous records on clay tablets, and thousands of these have survived to this day, having been found among the remains of a merchant colony in modern-day Turkey. These were commercial letters, trade agreements, complaints about substandard goods, all the routine paperwork of trade. Yet beneath this trading city, something far more formidable was taking shape. The Assyrians lived in a dangerous region. To the south were the Babylonians, to the north were the Hurrians, to the west were the Mitanni. The Kassites were pressing in from the east. Over the centuries, successive empires had subjugated, controlled, and swallowed up Assyria, the Akkadians, the third dynasty of Mitanni. And while all this was happening, the Assyrians were watching. They were learning. They studied every empire that ruled over them, every military tactic that had been used against them, and every administrative system that had been employed to hold vast territories together. When the opportunity finally arose, they would use everything they had learnt. The first true Assyrian expansion began around 1300 BC under the reign of Adad-nirari I, who did not merely fight his enemies, he exiled them. Whole populations were displaced from their homelands and resettled elsewhere. This sounds ruthless, and it was. But it was also a shrewd form of governance. People uprooted from their homeland have no local allegiances or tribal networks to organize resistance. They became dependent on the empire that displaced them. This was an innovation brought by the Assyrians. It was not just military force, but administrative terror. They systematically destroyed the social fabric that made rebellion possible. By 1100 BC, during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser I, the Assyrian army had reached the Mediterranean for the first time. The king stood on the shore, performed a ritual, and declared that he had conquered the sea. This was quite a spectacle. Yet it was also part of the exercise of power. Then came the collapse. Around 1200 BC, the Bronze Age ended in a catastrophe that remains largely unexplained: the sea peoples, climate change, and the collapse of the system. All the great powers in the eastern Mediterranean collapsed. Egypt weakened, the Hittites vanished, the Mycenaeans perish. Assyria survives, damaged, diminished, and weakened, but it survived. As the ancient world slowly rebuilds itself over the following centuries, Assyria emerges from the ruins with a unique advantage: experience, memory. It has the accumulated knowledge of how to build and maintain an empire, which was preserved in the wake of the collapse that destroyed everyone else. By 900 BC, the Assyrian Empire was on the verge of entering its most extraordinary period, the period that would give rise to Nineveh, the period that would give rise to the world's first superpower. But this period would come to an end within 3 months, in 612 BC. But first, the rise. By 900 BC, the Assyrian Empire had become the most powerful military force the ancient world had ever seen. They had professional soldiers, iron weapons, siege engineering. They had a communication network that transmitted information faster than any empire before it. They had an administrative system sophisticated enough to hold together a territory stretching from Egypt to Persia. At the heart of it all was a library. Ashurbanipal, who reigned during Nineveh's golden age, was not just a conqueror. He was something far stranger. He was a scholar, a reader, a writer, a collector. He sent agents to every corner of the empire with a single order: find every existing clay tablet, make a copy of it, and bring it to Nineveh. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Sumerian flood myth, medical texts, astronomical observations, mathematical tables, religious hymns, laws. Everything written in cuneiform throughout the 3,000-year history of Mesopotamian civilization has been copied, cataloged, and stored in the royal library at Nineveh. Without Ashurbanipal's library, we would know almost nothing about the Sumerians, or about Babylon, or about the ancient world. Ashurbanipal was responsible for some of the most ruthless military campaigns in ancient history. Cities were burned, peoples were exiled, and countless people were killed. This fact was proudly carved into stone. Yet he is also the man who saved the accumulated knowledge of human civilization. So how can you hold both these things in your mind at the same time? How could the man who ordered the systematic destruction of entire cities also build the library that preserved all that humanity had ever learnt? How can this paradox be explained? What does this tell us about power? That the most terrifying empire in ancient history was also home to its greatest library for a brief moment. Ashurbanipal became king of Assyria in 668 BC. He inherited the largest empire the world had ever seen. By any measure, he was the most contradictory ruler in ancient history. On the one hand, there was the library, tens of thousands of clay tablets. Agents were dispatched to every corner of the empire to copy every existing text. This was the systematic and obsessive preservation of human knowledge, which would survive the destruction of Nineveh and eventually reach the British Museum, conveying to us everything we know about the ancient world. In contrast, the records he left of his own military campaigns are more problematic. Ashurbanipal did not merely defeat his enemies, he documented what he did to them with such intense pride that it remains difficult to read even 3,000 years later. I cannot describe here the savage things he did, which he carved into stone. Not as a warning, as a boast. This is the man who saved the Epic of Gilgamesh. His first major campaign was against Egypt. By 671 BC, his father, Esarhaddon had already achieved the first foreign conquest of an entire country in history. Ashurbanipal finished the job. By 663 BC, the Assyrian armies had sacked Thebes, Egypt's ancient capital, a city that had stood for 2,000 years. The treasures of Thebes flowed into Nineveh. Nineveh, which reached its zenith during Ashurbanipal's reign, was an extraordinary place. In the palace known as the Unrivaled Palace, there were at least 80 rooms lined with carved stone panels. These panels depicted military campaigns in extraordinary detail. They also depict lion hunts. Ashurbanipal hunted lions, not in the wild, though he hunted them in an arena where the lions were released, and the king killed them with spears and arrows from his war chariot. Like everything in the Assyrian Empire, this was a spectacle. The king was conquering the most dangerous animal in the known world. It was a display of royal supremacy over nature itself. Yet amongst those carved panels, there is something that stops every historian in their tracks. A female lion on the verge of death, pierced through the spine by arrows. With her hind legs paralyzed, she drags herself forward on her forelegs, her mouth agape as she roars in agony. This is one of the most extraordinary works of art produced in the ancient world. The details are heartrending. The care taken to depict her suffering the way her hind legs drag, the angle at which her head is held, and the expression of pain on her face suggests that the sculptor was not celebrating the hunt. They were mourning something. Why did the most powerful man in the world commission a statue of a dying animal rendered with such empathy? No one knows. In 650 BC, Nineveh was at its zenith. The walls were complete. The library was full. The palace was complete. The empire stretched from Egypt to Persia. There was no power on earth that could challenge it. Yet within 40 years, everything lay in ruins. Within 3 months, the world's greatest city lay in ruins. 3 months, against walls so thick that kings had once held chariot races on them, against an empire that had stood for 3 centuries, against the most advanced military force the ancient world had ever produced. And then, silence. Not just defeat, oblivion. The Babylonians and Medes did not just conquer Nineveh, they systematically destroyed it stone by stone by stone, building by building. By diverting the course of the Tigris River, they flooded the areas that fire had not reached. They eradicated all memory of the city. Within 2 centuries, no one remembered it had ever existed. Just think what that means. The city that founded the world's first systematic library, the city that meticulously copied every text it could find to ensure the survival of knowledge, was utterly forgotten. Even the Greeks passing by its ruins 2 centuries later could not utter its name. The people who invented the preservation of knowledge failed to preserve their own memory. But the real question underlying this is this. The library survived, buried beneath the burning roof that collapsed onto the tablets. The fire, which should have destroyed everything accidentally, hardened the clay tablets. It preserved them better. 2,500 years later, archaeologists excavated the tablets and transported them to London. Ashurbanipal's library is now housed at the British Museum. The Epic of Gilgamesh can still be read. Medical texts, astronomical observations, love poems, and legal codes are all still there. The city was destroyed, but knowledge survived. You should reflect on this. The most ruthless empire in ancient history built the library that preserved all that we know about the ancient world. The fire that destroyed the library inadvertently preserved its contents. The city that invented the preservation of knowledge has itself been forgotten, but what it saved has not. Is this a tragedy? Or is this precisely how civilization works, swinging between destruction and preservation and safeguarding its contents while losing the vessel? In Gallery 10 of the British Museum in London, there is a stone slab measuring approximately 2.5 meters in length. Carved in Nineveh around 645 BC during the reign of Ashurbanipal, it depicts a female lion. It depicts a female lion. It has been struck by arrows through its spine. Its hind legs are completely paralyzed. It cannot stand. Instead, it drags itself along on its forelegs, with its useless hindquarters trailing behind it. Its mouth is open. It is roaring, or perhaps weeping. The details are extraordinary. The way its hind legs are dragged, the angle of its head, the tendons on its neck, the expression on its face. Every historian who has stood before this panel says the same thing. The person who carved this was not celebrating. They were mourning. Now, here is what you need to understand about the context. This panel was commissioned by Ashurbanipal. He was the man who ordered the carving of enemy kings being paraded on leashes through the streets of Nineveh. He was the man who flayed his enemies alive and recorded it as a military triumph. The man whose campaign inscriptions read like a systematic catalog of atrocities. And yet, he commissioned this. Lion hunting reliefs are not unusual. Every Assyrian king hunted lions. It was a spectacle, a display of royal supremacy over the most dangerous animal in the known world. The king conquered nature, just as he conquered nations. It was propaganda. But this panel is different. It was not created to demonstrate supremacy. The female lion in this panel is not being conquered. She is suffering. Whoever depicted this suffering, whether Ashurbanipal specifically instructed it or an artist, witnessed the truth and was granted permission to carve it, portrayed it with an empathy and care unparalleled in ancient Assyrian art. There are some theories. Some historians argue that Ashurbanipal identified with the lion. In Assyrian symbolism, the lion represents royal power, so a wounded or dying lion serves as a meditation on the mortality of kings, on the fragility of power. It is a reminder that everything that reigns will eventually fall. If this interpretation is correct, then Ashurbanipal, at the height of his power and ruling from the most powerful city in the world, was already contemplating his own demise. In some sense, he already knew that his empire would not last. However, other historians argue that it is simpler than that. They claim that a great artist observed the reality of a creature born into danger and depicted it truthfully. They argue that Ashurbanipal, whatever his crimes, recognized the truth when he saw it and chose to preserve it. The relief has stood for 2,670 years. The empire that commissioned it survived for a further 33 years after it was carved, and then vanished so completely that its name was never mentioned again. The dying lioness is still roaring. Make of that what you will. It all began with a question. How could the world's greatest city, whose walls were so thick that kings held chariot races on them and which had defeated everyone for 3 centuries, fall in just 3 months? Here is the answer. It wasn't because Babylon and the Medes were stronger. They weren't. Nor was it because Nineveh's walls collapsed. They withstood everything that was thrown at them for 3 months. Nineveh fell because of what Assyria had done to everyone else. For 300 years, the Assyrian Empire was ruled by a single principle: total, systematic, and calculated terror. They deported entire peoples to flay enemies alive, to carve this into stone. The aim was to ensure that everyone knew what would happen if they resisted. It worked. It worked perfectly for 300 years. But terror comes at a price. Every city burned, every people exiled, and every enemy humiliated, created someone who would never forgive. The Babylonians remembered what Sennacherib had done to their cities in 689 BC. The Medes remembered every invasion of their lands: the Elamites, the Egyptians, the Israelites. When the Assyrian succession struggle first weakened the empire in 627 BC, all the peoples they had terrorized saw the same thing at the same time: an opportunity. The Babylonian-Median alliance that destroyed Nineveh in 612 BC was more than just a military coalition. It was the release of 3 centuries' worth of pent-up anger seizing its moment. Nineveh did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it had far too many enemies for far too long. Then there is the library. Ashurbanipal built the greatest library the ancient world had ever seen. He sent agents across the empire to copy every existing text. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood story, medical texts, astronomical observations, everything. When Nineveh burned, its library burned with it. Yet the fire that should have destroyed the clay tablets only hardened them further. It preserved them. 2,500 years later, archaeologists found the tablets beneath the rubble and transported them to London. Ashurbanipal's library is now housed in the British Museum. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest story in human history, can still be read today. The medical texts are still legible. Modern science has verified the astronomical observations. The library that preserved everything we know about the ancient world was built by the most ruthless empire in ancient history. It was a fire that destroyed the library that, by chance, saved it. The dying lioness, carved with heart-rending empathy by a king who flayed his enemies alive, still stands in Gallery 10 of the British Museum. She still roars. She stops every historian who passes by. Nineveh is gone. The mound on which it stood, surrounded by a city that has witnessed both its destruction and its survival, lies in modern-day Mosul. The Tigris still flows beside it, the same river that left its ruins submerged in 612 BC still flows towards the same sea. The walls that once hosted chariot races are now low grassy ridges. The unrivaled palace has turned to dust. The library that saved civilization is in London. But something of Nineveh remains here. It lives on in every story stretching back to Gilgamesh, in every legal system derived from Mesopotamian law. It remains in every astronomical calculation based on the observations recorded on those tablets. Even in the fact that a minute has 60 seconds, which stems from the number system invented by the civilization that built these walls. The world's first superpower lasted 3 centuries, but collapsed in just 3 months. But what they built and preserved has endured for 2,500 years. And the lioness still roars.